Ah, yes, the 80s, a simple time when neo-Nazis needed to rob banks to raise money, unlike today where they just sell merch out in the open, along with gaining assistance to do so from various companies who help process their payments and keep their websites up and online so they could spread more hate. Howdy, I'm Jeff Goldsmith, and this is the Q&A. My agenda is simple. Each week I plan to bring you in-depth insights into the creative process of storytelling. And folks, yeah, this one's personal. Not a fan of neo-Nazis, obviously, and it is still a problem today, which is why today's film, The Order, still has resonance and still is an important story that I'm glad was told. And for that reason, I'm very happy to have with me screenwriter Zach Baylin. And, we had a really good chat about what it took to make this movie. We, of course, talk about his creative process and the research he did and all the influences he got, including, of course, the book that the movie is partly based on. And we've interviewed Zach before, and he was very forthcoming about his creative process and what it took to get this film made. So I know you'll dig this episode. And speaking of things to dig, Backstory Magazine just turned 12, and we couldn't have done it without you. So thanks for your support. And we just published our Gladiator 2 issue, which is full of spoilers and all interviews. That's right, it's all in issue number 54, and we are continuing to add new articles to issue 54 as the year progresses because this is phase one of the award season. So you'll be able to read cool articles there and read scripts in their entirety that are in competition for awards. If you've never read Backstory before, I hope you test drive us by reading us over at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, I hope you'll consider getting a subscription, and you could use discount coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off a 1-year subscription. Of course, you could also gift a subscription to the important storyteller in your life. Just click gift subscription on checkout. But remember to think about when you're doing it, because the minute your transaction goes through, their subscription will be emailed to them immediately. So if you want to time it for a specific day or date, make sure to do that before you finish your transaction. But look, it would really mean a lot to me to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where you could see all these Zoomcasts. That's right, you could see us talking. It would really mean a lot to me to have your support for independent entertainment journalism. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right into our interview with screenwriter Zach Baylin about his new film, The Order, which is in theaters right now. Okay, Zach, it's good to see you. How's it going?
Yeah, good, good. Thanks for having me back.
It's good to have you back. And the last time we spoke was for King Richard. I guess since some time has passed, what would you say was your biggest lesson off that's kind of informed you moving forward on other projects?
I mean, that was a tremendous learning curve for me. That was the first movie that I had produced, but I was really lucky. I got to be on set for, basically every day of that. And we did a lot of rewriting on the day on set, and Ray Green, the director of that, has a really naturalistic style. And I think that really benefited the film. And I think the ultimate script that was produced is better than the script that I initially wrote. And so I think just, getting to have had the experience of actually working with actors and then in writing towards them as you get deeper and deeper into development, I think that's been like the biggest change in the way I work probably. And, a real luxury, because most of the time, actors have actually tremendous ideas, and they're incredibly, fluent with language. So sometimes you write things on the page that you're like, oh, this is brilliant. And then it actually doesn't sound good coming out of someone's mouth. And so having to have those experiences, I think has been really, really valuable.
A lot of those types of things, and by the way, it was awesome that you were Oscar nominated for your first produced screenplay. That was like
It
incredible.
was
But
cool.
a
Yeah.
lot of those things you're talking about is like having the luxury of being able to have a writer on set or having a good table read where a writer is at and stuff like that. Is that something that you would say is now important to your process of like being able to be around and do those tweaks with actors?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can't dictate it all the time. And yeah, sometimes it's really out of your control. And I've been involved in things that I was not on set, or there was no table read, or I did a pass of something, and then I have no idea, it went out into the ether, and then a movie gets made. And yeah, so I think as much as a writer as you can be involved, I think it's incredibly beneficial, and it's just fun. I mean, that's, I think a lot of times we get siloed, and there's like this, you know, expectation that you've done your part, and you just kind of, okay, now hand over the blueprints to the thing, and we'll take it from here. And in my experience, filmmaking is so fluid and it's changing all the time, and having the ability to adapt is really, really important. And if you don't have a writer there, I think, unless people are really, really skilled at that, and a lot of directors are also great writers, but I think having someone there that is, it's like, job is to just maintain story. I think it's really valuable.
I do too. I think that's great. So, I love this movie, The Order,
Oh,
and
thanks.
we're gonna hold off on getting into the spoilers for a little while because we're gonna talk spoiler free for a while. But we're gonna talk about things that are clear in the trailer. And this spoke to me a lot. I interned many years ago for a man named Leonard Zeskin, and he worked with Klan Watch and the FBI and I believe another organization in the trial to prosecute the people that killed the Denver radio host Alan Berg,
Oh,
which is
wow.
something that took place in this movie. So I was very familiar with the case, and I was kind of a research analyst for him and also his computer guy. The research materials that I saw, even back in those days, they were all on paper, they were horrendous. And sadly, growing up in Kansas, I encountered a lot of racism and homophobia and anti Semitism growing up. So the research materials that I went through didn't shock me, but it was interesting to see how it all coalesced into this movie, which just starts with the death of Alan Berg. And it seemed like your research was fantastic. And I know that the movie is based on the book to an extent, Silent Brotherhood by Gary Gernhardt and Kevin Flynn. Tell me about your research process and what it was like getting into this bank robbery spree that was intended to support the war chest of the neo-Nazis back in the 1980s.
My pathway into this, and how I found eventually that book, was a little bit backwards to maybe the way I normally work, where you read a book and you're like, there's an incredible story here. I had been working with a producer, this guy Brian Haas, and we've been looking into stories about like the American militia movement. And this movie has been in development for a long time, but that was probably 2016, 2017, when there'd been this huge rise in far right activity and domestic terrorism, and the Unite the Right rally had happened in Charlottesville. And so we were kind of like researching these groups, and I got very interested in Timothy McVeigh. And so I was doing a lot of reading about McVeigh and how he became radicalized, and how he ended up sort of coming to the plans for the Oklahoma City bombing. And I went to Oklahoma City, and I went to the bombing memorial. And in the bombing memorial museum, like, one of the first displays has this book called the Turner Diaries. And it's a fictional book written in the 70s about a group of white supremacists who rob banks in armored cars and create a war chest to try and overthrow the US government. And in the book, there's also plans for what basically was the Oklahoma City bombing. And McVeigh found that book because in the 80s, this other group had tried to put that book into practice. So this group called The Order that was founded by a guy named Bob Matthews, and that was kind of how I got introduced to the story. And I saw a little clip in a documentary of a bank robbery or armored car heist that this group had pulled off, because they, in 1984, I believe, they pulled off the biggest armored car heist in U.S. history at the time. And so my entry point immediately was like, oh, one, this is the origin story of kind of domestic terrorism in America, but also it's a heist thriller. And so those things, like the kind of clarity of what kind of movie it was kind of right away, just because I think your inception with an idea usually immediately sort of forms like what direction you're going to go with things. And so once Brian and I sort of like got very interested in that story, we went out and tried to find a piece of like research material, we found Kevin and Gary's book, which was just this incredibly researched account of the aftermath of Alan Berg's murder and then the whole history of this group. And those guys had been Denver Post reporters who had covered Alan's murder.
Oh,
And so
okay.
then that's how they became involved in the story.
That's fascinating. I mean, when I was working again with Leonard Zeskin, that was one of the first things he had me do was he gave me this copy of the Turner Diaries by
Oh, wow.
William Luther Pierce, and he said, "Go through this." And he's like, "Just see the way that they're thinking in this book, and then see if you could see people copying that sentiment in all these other materials that I'm going to give you, and if any of them seem like they're getting closer to that organizing, because the book is in 6 steps, and the
Yeah.
first step is organizing and basically building your army per se. And so that's what the stuff was that I was going through as research materials, which were in those days pamphlets,
Yeah.
like that they were using, because it was right before, as I'm an old man, it was the 90s, and it was right before they were fully online the way that they are now. And it was shocking to go through and see how many copycats out there were of this book, The Turner Diaries, which is a horrible book. And I felt the movie did a really, really good job of showing the impact of that book, because the book was seen as a visual cue a few times as this discarded book that was just left around at different places. Because that's
Yeah.
the way that they were getting it out there in the days. They were printing it, they were funding printing it for free and just leaving it places where they were hoping that the right kind of people would pick it up and then would spread it to somebody else.
It was a seed that was kind of passed around among these groups, and I think the way that that McVeigh sort of found it because of what Bob and his group had done, and then in January 6th at the Capitol, it was being quoted, and
Well, yeah, I mean, I might as well point out now that, like, not only was your director so smart for in the order to show the way the book was really just left around, because they showed that in the movie. Justin Kurzel, your director, it was also really smart the way that they were showing pictures from the book. The most daunting of which, as you say, really leans into the January 6th insurrection, because that is one of their goals, which is to have political upheaval by publicly executing politicians that they don't agree with. And there's a picture in the book that they show on the film a few times of people being hung outside of the United States Capitol. And I'm sure we remember on that day there was a group of people, sure enough, that were yelling to hang Mike Pence outside the Capitol, and even had nooses on fixed pieces of wood they put up there, because that was part of their plan that day. And it really brings home how this horrible concept from the Turner Diaries hasn't really gone away in the ensuing years, unfortunately.
there's a segment of the book that predicts a day called Day of the Rope, where all of the race traitors will be hung up in the streets, and that quote is, and that sort of idea was being bandied about, you know, whatever it was, 4 years ago. And so, I think that part of what we felt was just urgent about the movie was that it felt incredibly relevant, even though it was something that happened 40 years ago now. So Justin, the director, is just, a fantastic talent and just a really terrific guy. But he had dealt with this kind of subject matter in a lot of his films, and he's Australian, but I think he felt like it was something that was Australia is reckoning with. And I know Jude Law, who plays the FBI agent in the movie, spoke a lot about that, was really a universal issue that he was feeling in England as well. And it's scary, and but it's also just preposterous in the fact that this group read this book and basically said, we should, this is a pretty good plan, we should do this. And they really followed those steps, those 6 steps, in an effort to try and eventually really reach the Capitol and overthrow the government. And that, to me as a screenwriter, it was pretty exciting to sort of find that and realize that there was a point in the detectives' investigation where they found the book and realized that that's what the group was doing, and were sort of then both terrified of where they knew what the next intentions and steps were, but also perhaps had a chance to kind of get ahead of the group if they were if they knew where where their intentions were. So
That was something that I really admired about your screenplay, in which you're essentially dealing with a piece of exposition with the Turner Diaries. And you don't want to explain it in a way that's boring the audience or feels like a lesson. So for you and Justin to just have it as this thing in the background, kind of bandied around, thumbed through a few times, it's not till probably Act Two that they're really getting into that there's these 6 steps and what's going on with that book and how they're trying to emulate it. And you handled it in, I thought, a really great way in
oh,
which
thanks.
they really just kind of outlined it and they put it up there on the board as this is basically what's going on and here's what step we're currently in and why we need to stop these guys. And you of course have the action of the bank robberies propelling your story's momentum forward so that you have enough time and enough interest from the audience to be able to sit still to hear what the danger is of the Turner Diaries as kind of this virus that's spreading in the neo-Nazi community. So, kudos to you on that.
Oh, thanks.
I
Yeah.
was driving the other day thinking about it. The most pathetic thing about the state of the world we're in right now is that the momentum of the movie is based around them robbing banks to arm their war chest. But as we've seen when these groups have gone online, they don't need to do that anymore. They're now
Yeah.
just openly selling neo-Nazi merch and making money that is being paid on people's Visa cards through Visa portals and not from the company Visa, but from some of the credit card gateway companies that allow neo-Nazis to operate and sell their merch online. And
Well,
that's how
our
they're funding their armies now.
Yeah, well, our production designer went to great lengths not to buy any of that stuff. But there's scenes in the film where the detectives where or go to the compounds of these white supremacists, and or they go to the compound of the Aryan nations, and there's huge swastika flags everywhere, and there's they had busts of Hitler that were
Yeah.
decorating their churches. And we made really conscious effort not to buy any of that stuff from anyone who sells it online because you're promoting that. But that all that stuff then had to be created by our art department, which ended up costing a lot of money. And then all that, we had to make a bust of Hitler that then was later, all that stuff was destroyed, so it didn't go back because there is a market for this shit,
Yeah.
and it's scary. I mean, what you're saying, that how like kind of normalized it is now, and that there is just an open marketplace for these things, that I think that was really one of the most dangerous things that Bob Matthews' ideology and efforts did, was that he was basically saying, like, we don't need to wear hoods. We don't need to be ashamed about our anti-Semitism and our racism. We're just going to wear it on our sleeve, and we're going to dress like everyone else dresses, because in his mind, like, it should be normal. And I think that idea is something that was very pervasive in an event like what happened in Charlottesville, where that was the first time, I think, for a lot of people, you were like, oh, this kind of hatred is just out in the open, and it's the people right next to us. And I think that was, for me, that was a really frighteningly enlightening day. And
Yeah. And it's,
and
I
I
mean,
think
it's still a
that's
problem.
a real lineage of Bob's.
I mean, it's still a problem. And there was, Nazis marching with masks this time through Columbus, Ohio the other day. And, they got into a scuffle out there. I mean, look, the only thing I'll say in closing about Leonard Zeskin was I'm pretty sure that he testified at one point during the trial, because he had this habit. This is the only other interesting thing about him that I always admired. He had this habit of going undercover with these organizations. And he's a Jewish man who sat in these meetings where they're talking about how they're going to literally find and kill Lenny Zeskind. And he's sitting there in a disguise in the meeting. Anytime they had data that was slightly accurate on him, he would actually throw, a loop in it and say, no, I heard he was in this town.
Yeah.
And they would believe him because he was their boy. He was just one of the guys somehow, because he was able to pull it off. He has an organization that I will name called the Institute for Research and Education of Human Rights. And it's an anti-fascist organization that basically tracks hate groups, and I believe, still works with law enforcement to help bring these people to justice, which they need to be brought to. I guess the other thing that is shocking that, was really good to see here is that it was a very emboldened FBI in your film. And they were dead set that what's going on with these groups is wrong. And we're in a very strange place now where there are FBI agents and cops alike who openly have neo-Nazi tattoos and those in the military as well. And the crackdowns have kind of shrunk in recent years, and it's
Mm.
just become an accepted thing, which is so wild because many of these folks take an oath to defend the United States from threats, foreign and domestic. And domestic terrorism is a real threat.
I mean, domestic terrorism, I think, is the number one, threat against America right now, and it has been for the last. I'm not an expert, but the last decade or so. And I think that in our film, that the FBI agent that Jude plays, is a composite and an amalgamation of a couple different agents, but those different agencies that work that case, FBI, like the DEA and the local sheriff's department in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where the group kind of disseminated from. It was at the time, it was one of the biggest manhunts in U.S. history to catch this group, and that they were, I think it was at a time where Ruby Ridge was around that era. Waco was later, but it was,
Yeah.
I think, this awakening for law enforcement agencies that there were these groups that were prepared to do really violent things, and that they don't think they quite had the understanding yet of maybe how to attack them and how to approach them. And I think that sort of that leap that the investigators had to make, and this wasn't just like, in our film, but in reality, that hate groups could also be activated to become militias, essentially, become that they could be
Yeah.
radicalized out of just hate speech and into action. And I think that was something that this group was one of the first times where that really happened, and it took a change in thinking in the way that the FBI investigated these groups.
I mean, you're showing them in their nascent years pre-internet, and it's so interesting because by starting your film with the death of Alan Berg, which I thought was a smart way to do it because he's an outspoken Jewish man on the radio, and he was fighting back against people, callers specifically into his radio program, who were spewing racist agendas. And so he was kind of like a one-man show in that sense, and that didn't gel with their version of the propaganda they wanted to get out there. And they certainly didn't like it when he outsmarted them with some of his retorts.
Mm.
So it was important for them in what has continued as a propaganda war now online to take out the competition. And that's, why they shot Alan Berg. So I thought
Yeah.
it was an interesting place to start. And I could see a movie made that has that really even more on the fringe. But I was glad that you guys made time for it because it was important to show that, these people that act like they're so tough saw a guy on the radio as a threat.
Yeah, and I mean, they were so offended by him, and they spent a lot of time calling into his show, and they actually had, so for listeners who don't know, Alan Berg was a radio host in the early '80s in Denver, but it was nationally syndicated show,
Yeah.
and he was kind of this instigator leftist who would pick fights with racists who called into his show. And Bob Matthews and his group were like frequent guests on it. I think it does show like how insecure and petty these guys were, that they had to target
Yeah.
this guy. And for me, that Alan's murder was another big kind of entry point to the movie, because my wife's family is from Denver and they knew Alan pretty well.
Oh, wow.
And so that was, I was not sort of aware of all that connections before my wife and I started really researching the film, but it was a really gruesome and shocking murder. And that they also, they had a hit list of other people that they were
Yeah.
trying to kill. Among those were like people like Norman Lear, who they felt were,
Sure.
a prominent Jewish comedy writer who was creating a vision of the world that they really didn't like.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it doesn't take much to intimidate a racist because they're very
yeah.
insecure. It was interesting. Like one thing to say just in case people have never seen it, there is a great movie that is a fictionalized, it is its own thing, but Talk Radio, which was a play
Yeah,
by Eric Bogosian, became a movie by Eric Bogosian made by Oliver Stone.
Oliver Stone. Yeah,
And it is a great movie, and it's about a talk show host who is dealing with, they remember Bob Matthews was not a guest, they were just anonymous callers, but we now know that, it was them. He was dealing with racist callers, and he has stalkers that want to kill him, and Eric Bogosian did it as a one-man show. It's still a just masterful movie.
yeah. It's a really, really great play and great movie. I saw it on Broadway. I don't know,
Wow.
a while back with Liev Schreiber in it, and it was amazing.
I
Um,
noticed that Jeremy Saunier was a producer, and I think he's great. How did he come on?
well, I met Jeremy. We were both living in New York, like in when I started developing this in 2016, 2017. I spent a lot of time talking with Jeremy about it, and he read many drafts of the script, and he was like a good collaborator and sounding board, and then stayed on as a producer. I think it was something that he flirted with a little bit. It was right around the time that Rebel Ridge was happening, which I think Rebel Ridge is a really fantastic movie. But yeah, I mean, Jeremy was like became a friend, but a real great sort of producer and sounding board on it, and good collaborator.
I think it's time to get into the spoilers, but before we do, what would you say is the budget and schedule for this movie?
Right. We had a really hard time getting the movie made. So much so, like I wrote the movie in, there were drafts of the movie that were done 6 years ago, and it
Wow.
was, was hard to find the right people that would fund it. So we shot the movie in just about 30 days,
That's great.
and I don't know exactly what the budget is, but it was, well under 20. And Justin is just like incredibly fast and efficient. And the guy who shot it, Adam Arkapaw, who's just incredible, who Adam, shot the first season of True Detective and among many other
Really beautiful
really,
photography, like without a
yeah.
doubt. Yeah.
And they'd worked together before, and we had a great first that this guy Eddie that they had all worked with. So the three of them really figured out sort of how to make the movie on a budget. I mean, that big car heist that takes place on the mountainside, I think they shot that in a day.
The decision to make a composite character, I think it makes sense because it allows you to coalesce a lot of other ideas into that one character. But was it always that way in your early drafts, or did you ever focus on one real life character?
We always, me and Brian Haas, like the first producer, we always decided to composite that character for a couple of reasons. One, it just the ways in which the investigation spanned many different states. It was like there wasn't one person that sort of started it and ended it. And so we definitely wanted a protagonist that was going to be able to sort of follow through. I was very interested in trying to create a character that, would be counterpoint to Bob, both in his ideology, but also kind of his lifestyle and the ways in which, both. So Bob is incredibly misdirected, but that he was trying to create some kind of future for his family, for his community. And while he had a terrible, insidious idea of what that was, that was sort of the same thing that the investigators were doing as well. That they were trying to create the world that they wanted their families and loved ones to inhabit and inherit, and that wanted. I was very interested in trying to create an investigator who had, in his efforts to do that, had really lost that family and had really lost almost everything, and that was someone who was not clean living and was just really saddled in booze and cigarettes and and just like was wearing the toll of his life on him.
Yeah.
That was not the case with like the main investigator who there was a FBI agent who moved to Coeur d'Alene in the early 80s and so the initial sort of threads of the case are very accurate to what happened to him, but he was a very upstanding person, and that wasn't as interesting to me.
I also admire the fact that you allowed this movie to be a slow burn of an investigation. You really spent the time to make the world of the neo-Nazis real and lived in. So with the death of Walt at the beginning and then the interview of Walt's wife, just showing, really poverty-stricken folks who are completely misguided by racist propaganda in which it promises to be the only thing to lift them out of their situation. And I thought that was a good way to go. I could see a lot of movies only focusing on the bank robberies and not the families. Even at one point later on in the movie, and by the way, I forgot to make this official announcement. We are in the spoilers section, kids. If you have not yet seen The Order, please go out and see The Order. It's in theaters, and if you don't see it in theaters, obviously catch it on VOD. Once you see it, click back here because we are in the spoilers. You've been warned. When you get into these other elements, even the investigation when it goes to the really pristine home of one of Bob's underlings and interviews the parents, and they're just kind of shell shocked in their perfectly clean upper middle class house. They have no idea how their son became the way that he is now. Now, I personally believe a lot of racism and those kind of seeds starts at home and is passed on generationally. But of course, there's people that aren't that way, and their kids get caught in the web of the propaganda of the neo-Nazis, which we're still seeing happen today, especially online. And so I
Yeah.
thought it was interesting that you took the time out for scenes like that, scenes with Walt's wife. I thought it was a good way to add like some texture and flavor to the piece as well.
No, thanks. That was very intentional and something that I wanted to do and that Justin was very additive to as well. And I think, again, just sort of hitting back to the central idea about community and family and sort of what molds us and where these fracture points happen. I think that Ty Sheridan's character has a scene with Jude where he basically says that not everyone in these communities are racist, and that there's a point where your life can go one way or it can go the other, and if you don't have the support, if you don't have the opportunity, and you fall off the cliff, and then you begin looking for reasons and people to blame, and so I think that idea was something that really stuck with me, and wanted to sort of make sure that we had the time in the film to understand sort of where those rupture points are in people's lives. The scene that you were discussing where Jude and Journey Smollett's character go to that house, that was a real event. And that character, this guy David Lane, was one of the members of the Order. His father was a pastor or a Lutheran minister or something. And they were really flabbergasted with what had happened with him. And David had been adopted and had reconnected with his biological sister, and she was a racist and like into these. It was a member of a white supremacist group, and so I think it's again it goes back to people who are marginalized and are looking for community and find it, and how dangerous it can be when someone like Bob, who is charismatic and is offering like an easy solution, an easy way to kind of look at things, and it's really dangerous.
Ooh, hey, I'm jumping in really quick to remind you about Backstory Magazine. We turned 12 this year, and we couldn't have done it without you. And our Gladiator 2 spoilers and all issue, that's right, issue number 54 just came out. And since we're a digital magazine, we will keep updating issue 54 with new articles and content. And of course, because it's the award season, there will be a whole bunch of new screenplays that you'll be able to read in their entirety as well. And that's the fun of being a digital magazine. Even after we publish, we keep updating it with new articles. If you've never read Backstory before, you could read us on a desktop or laptop at backstory.net or via our iPad app Backstory. And there's a free issue that you could read in its entirety. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, I hope that you will consider becoming a subscriber to support independent film journalism. And just to sweeten the deal, I'm giving you coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off your 1-year subscription. And remember, you could also give a gift subscription to Backstory, just click the gift subscription little box in your Backstory.net checkout. And remember, you'll get access to both the iPad app and Backstory.net as a subscriber. And one important thing to keep note of is the minute you complete your transaction for your gift subscription, it's sent out immediately. So if you want to time it to a specific day or date or time, make sure to do that because your recipient of who you're giving the gift to will be notified immediately. But look, it would really mean a lot to me to gain the support of my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where all these Zoomcasts go. That's right, you could watch us talking. It would really mean a lot to me to have your support for my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. But now, without any further ado, let's jump right back into our interview with screenwriter Zach Baylin about his new film, The Order, which is in theaters right now. You know, the character of Jamie you were talking about before, Sheridan plays him. It was a great drawn character, and the stakes are there for him because he has a Native American wife. And so, you know, he doesn't want violence from racists either in his community, and he's a deputy there. Was that a real character, or was that, again, a composite?
It is a composite, but there was a much older guy who was the undersheriff in Coeur d'Alene. And when the FBI agent came and took over that office that had been closed down for a long time, going back to what you were saying before that about pamphlets, the Aryan Nation was printing all these pamphlets, to recruitment, and they were just openly putting them up all around town. The undersheriff came to the FBI agent and basically said to him, these pamphlets are not the only thing that the group is printing, that they're using their printing presses to make counterfeit money. And that really was kind of the beginning of the investigation, like it is in the film. But no, I'm wanting to sort of have a bit of a mentor protege relationship between Jude's character and Jamie, Ty's character, was something that I invented. And this is, again, what we're talking about in terms of the advantageousness of being involved throughout the course of a shoot, is that Justin cast that actress, and it was not written that it was a indigenous role. And he saw her tape and was like, she's fantastic. And once he did that, then we said, oh, well, this is really actually amazing opportunity. And so then we rewrote the script, to sort of reflect that. And I think those are the kind of, I don't know, just, little things that if you're on your toes and you're available to do the work, it's really great.
Yeah, and I mean, look, it was a tragic arc in which, Jamie gets shot during a chase with Bob and dies. And it shows again the stakes. And, over the years, there's been a lot of law enforcement that, have died at the hands of neo-Nazis as undercover operatives, sometimes in shootouts. So, I mean, I thought it was a good trope, and I thought the way that it was directed was really well done. It was a good chase through the suburbs, through these small neighborhoods, again, showing how these are the people next door and, how they hate their neighbors, or they hate some of their neighbors. And
all that was very factually accurate, and that, that scene at the motel was like, incredibly factual, and that chase happened. And, an agent was shot by Bob when he was escaping. But again, like, Ty is a big hunter. And as me and him and Justin were sort of talking about the choreography of that, Ty basically said, sometimes when you kill a buck, the adrenaline hits and it will not react to the shot immediately, and it'll keep running. And then it'll just kind of drop out of nowhere. And so as Ty was saying that, we were like, that's how we should stage this shooting, so that he gets shot and Jude just bolts right past him because Ty's still on his feet and he's still firing, and so that choreography, again, was something that came out of just like those discussions. And I think it's really, really effective, and Justin did a great job.
It seems like, there's a hunting motif, obviously, as well, because you have Jude Law's character as a hunter, kind of like, a bit of a deer hunter, nod in there, in which he has a shot that he doesn't take. And that's something that happens in the movie as well, because there's a scene where during one of the robberies, for some reason, Bob lowers the gun of one of his gunmen as they're driving away that could have definitely shot Jude Law's character. Was that
Mhm.
based on something real, or was it just kind of the cat and mouse hunting that was being shown in the movie?
Well, Jude's kind of hunting that motif, was something that we developed in pre-production and rehearsals with Jude.
Sorry, I
And
mean specifically when Bob's character decides not to take a shot on Jude during one of the lottery.
you know what? To be honest, I can't remember if that's something that we
Okay.
invented or
All
not.
right. It was an interesting moment because you also see Bob later stalk, Jude Law's character when he's out hunting. And
Yeah.
again, could have taken a shot on him and doesn't. And then it pays off in the end when his character runs into the burning house, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, and basically there's a standoff again between them in which, he's trying to get him to come out of the house. So
Yeah.
it kind of was showing this cat and mouse, who's the hunter, who's the prey between these two. And I thought that was interesting.
I can't remember if in that heist in the mall that was a factual event or something that we invented. But I think this idea of certainly martyrdom and
Yeah.
what Jude's character was beginning to realize Bob's ultimate goal was something that we wanted to sort of see through the movie. And so not to jump ahead to your question about the end, but that shot not taken by Jude there was, really in an effort to not give this guy what he ultimately wanted, and so I think that it was something that we wanted to sort of pepper through the story so that it was earned by the end there.
Bob is a complex character. I'd love to talk about him for a moment. You had a very, lived in young character that just has gripes that most people around him can't properly articulate. And he really shines when he stands up at the big meeting and in front of Richard Butler, he basically makes his own speech talking about his goals and what's important to him. And again, his speech is all about seeing his father suffer economically and him deciding that he wants to take vengeance out against Jews for that, even though I'm willing to bet you Jewish people had absolutely nothing to do
Nothing to do with it. Yeah, yeah.
anything with his father's economic hardships, and that it wasn't like his father was working at a Jewish business or something like that. And that basically he gives this really rousing speech. And it was a perfect speech because it's kind of that wolf in sheep's clothing, saying like, I'm just a good guy, and I believe in the Bible, and this is our destiny, and this is our heritage, and this is what we need to do. Tell us about writing that speech, because it's tricky to do that, because if you wrote something that was too fervent, that was too over the top, you would kind of lose your audience, but you do it in a way that keeps people interested enough, even though they know that this guy is just slick.
Part of that speech, specifically when it gets into the ideology and his sort of invitation to come join them at his compound, a lot of that is verbatim from a real speech that Bob gave. So
Okay, great.
I had some of that in my back pocket to use, but then I think it was about trying to make it personal, which I think is what, good storytellers, good pitchers do, is to make it relatable to people in a way in which they can identify and they can put on their own experiences into it. And so I think it was trying to find that entry point that Bob could relate to this group of people. There were drafts of the script where Bob's relationship with his father was a lot of the beginning of the first act,
Oh, that's
and
interesting.
that his father died just like sort of a year before he really began to activate and become like take part in these robberies and really try and put this group up on its feet. And so his father had been a bit of a like regulating force in his life. And when he died, Bob just, basically said, I can start my life now. And so that at one point had been in the film. And so it was a story that in some ways I always wanted to make sure was part of it, because it really was the way he looked at his father was incredibly, motivational to him in why he went down this route. And then I just would say that Nick is a really, really fantastic actor and has so much natural just charisma, and he's just someone that you want to like lean into, and he brought this sort of allure to him that was really, really helpful. That you can't, I think it's very hard to write charisma, you
Yeah.
know, and so it helps when you have a great movie star playing that role.
It was also interesting. You show that, just some of his dynasty fantasies that he's having, in which basically, I guess this is true. I doubt you made this part up, in which he's married to a woman, Debbie, but she's
Yep.
unable to have kids. So Bob has a mistress who he's gotten pregnant, who's going to deliver him a baby, like, the way a king would in days of olds if his wife couldn't deliver a baby. And it seems like he also already has a son that I don't know if it was from Debbie or from someone else in the movie. He's at least teaching that little kid to shoot at one point.
That's his son. So he had a son with Debbie who was adopted, and he was always wanting his own.
Biological
And
son,
yeah,
got it. And so
so all that
that was
stuff
that
was
was a weird element. Tell us about just including that to show this just odd element in which, he wants to build this dynasty and have his own biological progeny, and his wife is somehow okay with this crazy plan. And, the mistress is just walking around and they're kind of not talking, kind of talking. Like it's weird.
I mean, I was fascinated in it just from a character point of view, the narcissism of it and the hypocrisy of trying to sort of build this like family community, but then and being, quote unquote, like very religious, and then just having this again permission structure where he could do whatever the fuck he wanted. And just kind of the double lives of what those relationships were and how he was again trying to build a community. I mean, for me, it was just it was really juicy sort of story and character stuff. Also, the fact that that child was born, right before he was eventually caught, and that it's in the movie, but this was real. That there was a picture that was taken of him and Zilla and that baby that was found at that hotel when the shootout happened. And that picture, to me was this incredibly damning piece of evidence, emotional evidence, that could be used. And it was Bob, someone gave in real life, someone gave up Bob's location at the house in Whidbey Island, but it's never been said who it was. But for me, the fact that that picture was found and existed was felt very, very leading that it was Debbie.
I agree with you. I mean, that seems to make sense. There's so many different elements to this movie in which, especially the religious part, in which the Reverend, like having, kind of the fire and brimstone element is something the neo-Nazis borrowed from the KKK. And it was interesting that aside from robbing banks, they were also randomly bombing porn theaters as
Yeah.
one of the things that they were doing as a distraction. But both the KKK and the neo-Nazis had small side porn ventures because they saw it as an unregulated business that they could make money from as a possible income stream. So, they're preaching Bible stuff on the one hand and then delving into amateur porn on the other. And I believe the neo-Nazis are still doing that. And it's now part of their whole, like an extension of Bob's dynasty thing, in which,
Yeah.
they're saying like, we're gonna procreate the proper race, and it leads to porn. It's baffling, these.
It's baffling, but I mean, for Bob's group, they saw themselves as very like wholesome. He was going around trying to bomb porn theaters because they thought it was ungodly, and so it's this. I mean, I find that stuff kind of hilarious that this, this group that is robbing banks and killing people takes this kind of weird moral stance
Right. And
about
it
porn.
was back in the days before the internet, so porn theaters were the prime place that people would ever see pornographic images.
Yeah,
Anyhow, it was right at the threshold of when home video started too, because it was the mid 80s.
yeah,
The final standoff is interesting because again, it goes to the whole climax that Bob's planning for himself, in which he realizes his loss can still be this, metaphorical gain for the movement by making himself a martyr. He hopes that he'll be, an inspiration to others. And he basically not only refuses to give up, but he wants to like go out in a blaze. And he wants to be this story that hopefully inspired others in his mind, but definitely did not, luckily. What could you tell us about getting that climax going at the end, and Terry rushing in? Was there in real life an agent that rushed in, or was that for dramatic effect? And by the way, it's fine if it was for dramatic effect.
That final confrontation was something that I invented and worked with Jude and Justin a lot on. The circumstances around that standoff that took place on Whidbey Island is very factual. And I think what was most important kind of for us was to sort of show at the end the fallacy of what Bob thought he was doing. That there's no he's typing up these letters that he's going to send to Congress, and that the idea that there's like this army out there waiting for his orders, and you see that it's just three guys in a cabin, with these illusions of grandeur, and so to really show at the end that he was alone, and this was, I think, an incredibly self-serving venture that he went on. And I think that is what it is for, I would imagine, for all of these kind of ideologues, that it's like you're just, or cult leaders, that you're really just sort of trying to create a situation where, you're being bathed in glory all the time. But I think his intention really was to try and be some kind of martyr. And maybe it was at a point where he realized that, that what he was doing was never going to sort of take off. Trying to find the nuance of how to do that without sort of giving this guy and this character what he wanted in the course of this film, was something that we all took seriously and tried to figure out how to frame it in a way. And I think Nick's performance is terrific, because you really see how afraid he is at the end. A real agent that had followed the case and was out there at Whidbey Island at the end, and was involved in sort of the last moments of the standoff, and was trying to get the FBI, or really trying to stop the FBI from sending the flares in, realizing that it was going to, both torch the house, but probably also that Bob would not come out. And that's what he wanted. And so, we really wanted that last moment between Jude and Nick. And so we put him in the house. And again, that was a real house that we had permission to like burn.
Really?
And so then once we were scouting it, we sort of then rewrote the choreography of it to match what that location was.
Were there any rewrites that you remember doing during production? Was there anything that needed like a big rewrite while you were shooting?
Not during production, but in prep a lot, because and a lot of it was just out of like necessity, the logistics. But I would say that the movie that we went into prep with, the script was 120 pages and somewhere around there. And the script that we locked was 100 pages. So we had to cut a tremendous amount of stuff.
What was something that was never shot that you want to tell us about?
There were more robberies. There was another very big robbery of a convenience store that was pretty exciting. There was a lot more kind of time with some of the ancillary members of the order. David Lane, was a guy whose family was in that very nice house. That there was more of a chapter with him, and then there's a composite character in the movie, Tony Torres, who was that guy is based on more or less a real guy, who was a Mexican guy who had joined this group of white supremacists and tried to convince them, and basically himself, that he was white. He ended up having a very big counterfeiting operation in Pennsylvania, where he was arrested, and then he ended up flipping and informing on the guys. But the sort of counterfeiting ring and the Philadelphia side of the story was in there for a while. And it was just like, a lot of it was just scope and logistics of having to cut things down. But
right. You also show Torres here as having bought the guns that killed Alan Berg as well.
That was something that we conflated with another character. There was a guy named Andy Barnhill who actually bought that gun. But and that was a really late sort of shift that we had to do when Barnhill became cut out, and we had to, for logistical purposes, we couldn't fabricate Philadelphia. We shot the movie in Calgary. And so that part got cleaved out, and then we made the sort of decision to try and to take Tony's arrest and shift it with the gun. And so that was a pretty late decision. I mean, I think from my mind, it's pretty seamless, but it was a late change.
Are there any deleted scenes that were shot that you want to tell us about?
There was so much stuff that was deleted. Really? Just as this incredible way of shooting, where he was like, for as little time as we had, the amount of things and alts that he was able to get is was amazing, and that
How many cameras was he shooting with?
he was only shooting with one camera.
Oh, really? And he was still able to pick up that much. That's great.
Yeah. And he has this really amazing way of doing, like, they would run whole scenes where he would say, "Don't say anything, let's do the whole scene with no dialogue. And now say what's there. Now just like, say whatever you want."
Was that
And
a was that a matter of getting reaction shots? Was it
it
for
was a
reaction
matter,
shots?
he told me that, over the course of his like years of making movies, that he had gone from being incredibly rigid about like, you know, I want, I'm trying to manufacture this exact performance, and then getting into the editing room and saying, well, fuck, like I got it, but actually realizing now it would be really helpful if this was a emotional scene and I made it funny or whatever the situation was. And so he told me now that he looks to have as many options in the editing room as possible.
But
And
was there one
so
scene that you want to pinpoint of something that you liked that was cut, but you got it, like it helped for pacing or whatever? Something specific on a Blu-ray or something like that?
I don't know. Let me come back to you.
Okay.
I mostly can think of things that he and Jude like did on the moment that I think that I didn't write that I think are amazing in the movie. That like Jude's in the car with Ty after that shootout in the mall parking lot, and he comes back in, he just starts wailing on the windshield and just being like fuck, fuck. And none of that was written, and he punched and he shattered that windshield, and he like almost broke his hand. And Jude is like just an incredibly intuitive actor, and really, he's been doing it for so long, and he still really goes for it and goes hard. And so he brought in amazing things that I didn't write that I wish I had.
What was your toughest scene? What was the scene that you kept coming back to over and over as a writer that, was maybe tough to crack at first? And then tell us how you creatively rose to the challenge.
I think one, like the structure of the movie was really challenging to crack because there were so many events, and trying to sort of match up what was happening on one side of the story while not letting that just prescribe and dictate what the investigators were doing, I found challenging because I wanted those characters to live and breathe and not just be beholden to the procedural parts of the story. So I think, for me, that was really challenging. I think that the most challenging sort of, let's say, sequence of the film was really, I would say, the whole first act was I spent a lot of time on, and over years changed it wildly.
What do you
Like I
think?
said
What do you
before.
think the problem was? Just getting people into the groove of the film and finding the footing?
Yeah, I think that for a long time I was really interested in showing Bob's turn into criminality, and that like to show him making the decision to form the group. And so I think those scenes were great, and it was really interesting story, but it just took too long to get into it,
No,
you
that's a
know.
fascinating lesson because really what you did was you just have, Jude Law's character find him that way. Like,
Yeah.
like he's already become that guy by the time he's there. But that is such a writerly thing to do in which you really wanted to show the audience how he went from being a normal guy into this bad guy. So
Yeah.
that's fascinating that was what was slowing you down because it's a legit thing that I could
Yeah.
see there being good
But
dramatic moments in as well.
it was really, but it also it kneecapped Jude's story because that story couldn't get started until a crime had been committed, really.
Yeah.
So then I found myself less invested in the FBI agent Terry's character as he tried to acclimate into this new life without the sort of other element of it. And now that I'm thinking of this, I'm remembering for years, because of that, Terry's story began in New York at the end of his last case. And
Okay.
so we showed him like wrapping up that case, taking the assignment to move out to Coeur d'Alene, and And so there was a whole prelude to like what is now the first act of the movie. And
So basically, it's the mafia case that Terry talks about later, where
yeah,
he felt guilty about losing one of their undercover people, which was again paralleled with what happens with Jamie in this story.
so it was a kind of, as Bob was ascending into his world, Terry was kind of ending that chapter of his own life, and we saw that event that he describes with Jamie, or at least we saw the aftermath of it, and then he decides to sort of escape and come to Coeur d'Alene.
Interesting.
It's funny, I totally forgot about that, but that was in the script for years. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, protagonist, antagonist. You were basically like if anything, you could say you were spending a little too much time giving your antagonist's backstory and realizing
Yeah.
that it was taking too long to get your protagonist into the focus. That's
And
fascinating.
sometimes you just don't see it, especially with like, I mean, I found, especially with like with these true stories, sometimes you get really fascinated with these minutia and detail and it takes a lot of sometimes outside perspective to sort of say, well, this doesn't have a place in the movie. It's fascinating, but it's not part of the story that you're actually telling in this script. That I don't find that easy to like weed those things out.
What's next? I mean, this took so long to get to the screen, as you said. What are you working on next? Is there anything else that you've been working on a bunch of years that's maybe coming to fruition? What can we look to next?
Yeah, thanks. I just wrapped a limited series that I wrote with my wife. It's called Black Rabbit. We shot it in New York. It's also with Jude and Jason Bateman, and it's a bit of a crime thriller, domestic drama about two brothers who own a restaurant in New York that becomes like the location of a big murder. And it kind of unpacks how Jude and Jason's, they play brothers, how their relationship like impacted this event. And it was really, really exciting. And it'll come out in sometime next fall on Netflix.
Is that
And
the first thing
Jason,
that you've co-written with your wife?
we wrote another script that has not been made, but that we had a really great experience writing it together. And she helped. She's producer on all the stuff that I've developed, and is like has always been a great like collaborator, sort of behind the scenes. And so we sort of test ran it in this other script that is a feature that's we're really happy with. And then, but this story, we had lived in New York for a really long time, and kind of that was not exactly our experience, but the world that we were trying to create was something that was like very nostalgic to us from our time of living there. And yeah, it was awesome. And then Justin came and directed the last two episodes of the show. It was nice to like, he had just finished, or we had just basically finished the order and came back and told Jason, we were like, man, we just had this incredible experience with this guy. We should try and get him for the last couple episodes. And so it was great.
Well, look, Zach, I really dig the order. It's a story about the 1980s, but it is still a complete threat today. So I thought you did a fantastic job highlighting that, and you've been very generous with your time today. So I thank you for that, and I can't wait to see what you do next. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I always love being on, listening.
And that's how the Q&A went down. Special thanks again to screenwriter Zach Baylin for being so generous with his time and chatting with us about his new film, The Order, which is in theaters right now. So I hope you go show your support for this cool independent film. Of course, while you're surfing around online, I hope you check out Backstory Magazine. We turned 12 this year, and we couldn't have done it without your support. And we just published our new issue. That's right, our Gladiator 2 spoilers and all issue. And because we're a digital magazine, we're going to, of course, keep updating it with new articles as they come in. And that's the cool thing about being a digital magazine. We could do that. And if you've never read us before, I encourage you to read our free issue, which you could do at backstory.net on a desktop or laptop or via our iPad app, Backstory. And if you like what you see, and I hope that you do, you could also use discount coupon code SAVE5 to save $5 off a 1-year subscription. I don't know if you know this, but you could also give the gift of Backstory to that awesome storyteller in your life by just ticking the gift subscription box at backstory.net in your checkout cart. And of course, you'll get access to backstory.net and to the iPad app. But please remember this, if you are giving a gift, the minute you complete your transaction, it is sent out to your recipient immediately. So if you need to time it to a specific date or time, you just might want to wait to do that. But look, it would really mean a lot to me for you to show your support for independent film journalism and my passion project. So it would be great to have my podcast listeners and Apple Podcasts and Spotify and my YouTube watchers of the Zoomcast, which you could see on the Backstory Magazine YouTube page, which is where all these Zoomcasts go. So that's right, you could see all these Zoom interviews and watch us talk. It would really mean a lot to me to gain your support for my passion project. So thanks for considering becoming a subscriber. The Q&A with Jeff Goldsmith podcast is a copyright of Unlikely Films Incorporated in 2024. All rights reserved. And folks, if you want to reach out to me, you could always find me on Blue Sky as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag, on Instagram as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag, on Twitter as Yo Goldsmith or Backstory_mag. I also have a Facebook fan page that's an easy way to find me, or you could even just write an email to backstoryletters@gmail.com. Or you could even go old school and drop me a line via email using backstoryletters@gmail.com, and I'll do my darndest to respond. I'm Jeff Goldsmith, the publisher of Backstory Magazine and the host of the Q&A, thanking you for tuning in and telling you to stay out of trouble. Till next week.